Okay, I have to begin firstly by saying that if anyone is coming to the issue of Palestine and of Black Lives Matter as someone who is not very experienced, both of you covered so much in depth and with such incredible integrity and great context as well. And in terms of wanting to bring you together, I just want to bring us back to what people want, sorry, see, I'm getting distracted by the chat box. I will look away from it for a second. What I want you to reflect on is the particular historical moment that we're in right now. So both of you have testified to the fact that there are interconnections and connected struggles that go back historically in terms of anti-colonialism and decolonization, which is not just a metaphor. But what is it about the particular historical moment that we happen to be in right now that has galvanized such a great deal of energy and passion to reinvigorate a new stage of this historical relationship? Adam.
So I guess I mentioned one or two of the factors that I think have invigorated things, of course, which I've of course already mentioned the fact that we're living in a moment of hyper nationalism, both in Britain and the United States, and of course in many other parts of the world as well. And I think that we've seen from many of the placards and posters and slogans, and that people are angry about that kind of nationalism. And I think that it's galvanized people into wanting to be part of an anti-racist struggle in ways that we haven't really seen before in this country. But I think it's also about the handling of the coronavirus as well. And I think people are really angry about the lockdown, the fact that the government neither governments in Britain or the United States have been taking the pandemic seriously. We've seen the ways in which working class people and racialized minorities have been disproportionately affected by the lockdown. It's really illuminating in really stark, quite quantifiable terms, how inequalities and how racial capitalism leads to premature death in these countries. And I think making that so stark has also angered people and galvanized them into mobilization. But I think it's also it's also been a snowballing of movements, right? Black Lives Matter didn't begin in 2020. It began in 2016, and many of the young people who have engaged in these protests are in their teens and were 12, 13 years old when Black Lives Matter was coined as a slogan. And I think there's two things very quickly that are important about this. The first is that the young people who have organized these protests came into political consciousness with a black president of the United States, right? But they also came into political consciousness with the Black Lives Matter movement. So what that implicitly told them was that a black president is not going to give them liberation, right? Representative politics isn't going to give them the safety and the dignity and the freedom it is that they want. But the second thing is that, of course, we're now in a movement, as I mentioned, of this fervent nationalism, right? That is totally disregards and doesn't even pretend to pay lip service to the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think both of these seemingly very different heads of state or types of parliamentary or presidential governance have demonstrated to a generation of young people that these institutions are not going to be the places that give us our freedom, and that grassroots movements are fundamentally important if we're going to make the changes that we need to see.
I think, Teo, you're asking me to speak, but you're on mute.
I was trying to not disrupt. May I have your reflections?
Sure. For me, there's two things going on. On one hand, I think for quite some time, there's been a snowballing of things that have come together, and people keep calling them crises. So there was the Eurozone crisis. Then there was the so-called refugee migrant crisis, although it was really a crisis of the EU. Then there's climate change. Young people knowing that they're likely not to have employment once they graduate university, the increasing university debt when fees were introduced, all of these factors, the increasing xenophobia that happened through the Brexit discussions, the rising levels of racism. If you walk down the street in a neighborhood like mine in Wood Green, you see police harassing young people on a daily basis. It's not strange to have seen it before. So I think all of these factors and these multi-crises have been adding up. And of course, COVID came and exposed a lot of this. But on the other hand, I think it's extremely important to remember that these flashes that we see don't just happen automatically. Underneath them, there's usually decades of organizing. And if there's anything we've learned from the discussions around abolition today, is the incredible work that Black feminists have been doing for decades in explaining what abolition even is. It's not like one day people woke up and decided, oh, we're going to defund the police and let's talk about abolition. This has been a project that has taken decades and a lot of organizing. Flashpoints are usually exciting and we think about them, but it's always important to consider all of the layers underneath that sustain us as movements. It's that hard work, long slog, and building that really causes these flashes to go in certain directions. And there's always the possibility, you know, that they go in a good direction or a bad direction. In the last wave, we saw it really move into electoralism, and we've ended up where we are today. So we need to always be careful to juggle these two things, making sure that we're not just excited by the flashpoints, but also having the analytical conversations and the longer term strategic discussions around how to build the movement.
Thank you. We have a question from Hussein Paliwala, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing anyone's name. They would like to know, how do we link the anti-colonial and anti-racist struggles for practical action? Adam or Rafif?
I'll let Rafif have a little breather, as she just spoke. So very briefly, I think it's important that we understand that we have to link anti-colonialism to anti-racism, right? But how are they linked, right? So we know that anti-racism and anti-colonialism are linked through broadly speaking, two things: racial capitalism and imperialism. So therefore, our anti-racism can't be about symbols or becoming incorporated into the mechanisms of the state, right? We don't want to have more police officers or more bureaucrats or more TV presenters who are Black, right? Any more than the anti-colonial movements wanted to have more Black colonial administrators, more overseers, more, colonial bureaucrats, right? That wasn't going to get them their liberation and freedom. Anti-racism has to be have an antagonistic relationship with the state. It has to understand that in the same way that the colonial power is reproduced by capital in the state, racism is reproduced by capital in the state. So anti-colonialism is so fundamentally important to anti-racism because it enables us to maintain a focus on the state and capital as the primary reproducers of racial governance, of racist governance, right? And it allows us to push back against the liberal tendencies which call for unconscious bias training, diversity initiatives, decolonizing your pet cat, like, all of this kind of really abstract, symbolic stuff that doesn't deal with the fundamental material realities of capitalism and the state. I'll leave it for Rafif to talk about.
I completely agree. I think on the analytical level, it's understanding racial capitalism and speaking about imperialism. I think for quite some time, we got very shy of using the word imperialism, and we need to reintegrate it into our vocabulary again. And speaking of anti-colonial solidarities and those legacies of solidarity across movements, they were anti-imperialist and not shy about being anti-imperialist. On a very practical level, I think conversations like this are extremely important. Building actions together. Solidarity is praxis. It's not simply the slogans and the talking. So much of what we learn in terms of practical action, that's what the question is about, was in doing. So when we're speaking about abolition or defunding the police or Palestine and boycotts, divestments, and sanctions, those are very practical initiatives that one can be involved in. And that's how we make our movements better, but that's how to practically impact the situation. And it's a learning process, and we all make mistakes, and it's a question of working together and learning from each other's mistakes. But for me, to speak of anti-colonial and anti-racist struggles and practical action, it's that action of praxis, of doing. It's not going to come just from analysis and reading books, but join the movements, do things, get out there, simple things like even organizing a protest or a boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign. When I worked on the Stop G4S campaign, for example, G4S is one of the largest security corporations in the world. They both had a contract with the Israeli prison service, but they were also deporting migrants and were giving fake leg things for prisoners here in the UK. They made the connections so clear for us that we could campaign and then make the connections ourselves.
Thank you both so much. We have loads of passionate questions. I'm going to try and summarize them because this would be your final response before we move on to the next speakers. Several of our attendees would like you to reflect in more detail on the relationship between capitalism and colonialism, and whether it is in fact possible to dismantle colonial structures without dismantling capitalism. And someone has also added privately to me that they would like you to think about how does Chinese capitalism or Asian capitalism fit within discourses of anti-colonial and anti-capitalist intersections. Thank you.
So I guess I don't want to be too abstract. I felt like I was far too abstract in my last response. But so colonialism, I guess, is the logical outcome of capitalist expansion, right? Capitalism is always looking for new markets, right? And those markets can't exist within the borders of the nation states from which capitalism arises, in this case, Britain or other parts of Western Europe. And so therefore, inevitably, it's looking for new markets. And so the quote unquote discovery of the Americas brings an opportunity for those markets, right? The colonization of Australia, right? The scramble for Africa, right? The East India, the East India Company, right? All of these, the Opium Wars, right? Capitalism constantly needs new markets in order to constantly expand. It needs resource extraction. It often needs more workers, therefore, to exploit. And therefore, colonialism is this fundamentally emerges out of capitalism. So you can't defeat colonialism without defeating capitalism. But I think the really important thing is that in order for capitalism to more effectively govern the peoples that are conquered by imperialism, by capitalism's expansion, it needs racial governance to put them into different categories in order to control them, in order to exploit them, in order to dehumanize them. This is a fundamentally important part of the expansion of capitalism, and this is why you cannot defeat racism without also dismantling capitalism.
I feel a bit silly. I keep saying I agree with Adam. I think the concept of racial capitalism is a really good one at making that connection. I don't think we could speak of racialization and racism without speaking of capitalism and how it functions. A lot of the racist categories that emerge out of the colonial project and colonial empires are still with us today. Now, there's a question here, though, around what we can do when, like the pragmatism question, and starting off with let's dismantle capitalism it is a bit of a very difficult one as a starting point. I think there's a lot of campaigns that people can get involved in that speak to that really clearly, but on a very practical, pragmatic level, I'm a little bit hesitant of slogans that don't really connect to work. So anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism, anti-racism, those are all fundamentals to everything that we do. They need to be connected to analysis and work that we are undertaking, and to ways that we can engage people with them and bring people into movements that are actually engaged in dismantling these forms. So certainly they are connected. I would not speak of racism without speaking of capitalism, because I do think there's a historical specificity to the way racialization operates today under capitalist mode of production today, and more conversation about that needs to happen. But I also think we need to link it very clearly to the actions that we're doing.
Thank you both very much for these incredible contributions. I have to also add that we still have loads of questions in the chat box, and I will make note to try and bring some of them back in the general discussion.